The subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself and Mr. Cicilline, who will read from Mr. Deutsch's prepared statement, is that okay with you, Mr. Cicilline? Or what, is that good?
I said mine. She said mine.
Oh, your own statement. I did not know. In his own words. Sorry about that. For our opening statements, I will then recognize any other member seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And without objection, the prepared statements of all of our witnesses will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length and limitation in the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. We're in the 5th year of the Syrian humanitarian crisis. The United States has contributed over $4.5 billion in both direct assistance and through 3 UN crisis appeals, with nearly 75% going through the latter, the crisis appeals. Yet there seems to be no end in sight in this tunnel. Russia's recent intervention is causing serious security concerns for not only the people of Syria, but the NGOs and the aid workers on the ground trying to bring assistance to those in desperate need. The front lines are shifting and the battle lines are fluid, causing uncertainty and making it increasingly dangerous to deliver aid to certain areas and making it increasingly dangerous for Syrians who remain in their homeland. The situation has gotten so bad that we're now seeing Europe struggle to deal with its greatest migration and refugee crisis since World War II, as many fleeing the Syrian conflict are trying to make their way into Europe. But while the European crisis may be grabbing the headlines at the moment, let's remember that this crisis was not created yesterday. For years, the people of Syria have been impacted, and the Syrian refugee crisis has also impacted countries like Jordan, like Lebanon, Turkey, and Egypt. And yet many in the international community ignored these countries' pleas for assistance. These countries are more vulnerable because they have less capacity and less resources to deal with the crisis. Let's take Jordan, for example. About 630 Syrians have been registered by UNHCR, plus hundreds of thousands more that have already assimilated in Jordan, all of which pays an incredible burden on the kingdom to provide basic services to over 1 million new people. But with more and more refugees seeking to reach Europe from Syria and its neighbors, there will, of course, be those seeking to take advantage. We're now seeing smuggling networks popping up in Turkey, Lebanon, Libya, and elsewhere, turning trafficking in Syrian refugees into a billion-dollar industry, and also creating security concerns as we have no way of knowing who is being smuggled into Europe and elsewhere. And with President Obama's announcement that the U.S. will take in 10,000 Syrians, this also raises concerns for many in the U.S., especially in light of the FBI director's testimony to Congress last week that the U.S. may not be able to properly vet all of those seeking to come to our nation. As a legislative body, this is something that we must take seriously. If we cannot guarantee the proper vetting of these refugees, it would be irresponsible for us to promote it. We must protect our country first and ensure that all security measures are in place to properly screen these individuals before they come into the United States. We cannot compromise the well-being of the American people or our national security. Unfortunately, it has taken Europe's worst migration crisis to awaken the Europeans now that the Syrian conflict is knocking on their borders. The United States has been the largest single contributor to the Syrian humanitarian crisis response, dwarfing the contributions made by any other nation and by the European nations as a whole. There's no way to tell how things may have turned out differently had other nations stepped up to the call like the United States did. Earlier this month, committee staffers traveled to Geneva to meet with many of the organizations that receive our assistance for the Syrian humanitarian crisis, and from their trip, one thing was clear. The response to the crisis has been dreadfully underfunded, with a nearly 2/3 funding gap. Of course, the problems we need to address are many, and they are difficult. And it's true that they can never be a solution to the refugee crisis until the underlying root causes are addressed. And that means finding an end to the fighting, an end to the terror, and the removal of Assad from power. But we need to be less reactive and start being more proactive. We need to start thinking of ways not just to address the refugees' most immediate needs, but the needs that they face in the years to come. And we can't do it alone. We need to press our European friends and our partners in the Middle East and Africa to step up and do more. We need to do a lot more to ensure that the needs of the host communities in Syria's neighbors are being met as well, because this has taken a very big toll on their resources, and it is leading to increased tension between the communities. There is a pervasive feeling of hopelessness and despair that will have a long-term impact on the region and beyond. Syrians, for the most part, want to eventually return home. According to some NGO implementing partners on the ground that have conducted surveys on this, some 90% of Syrian refugees reportedly state that they do have a desire to return home. But that desire may fade if the international community does not step up and do more to ensure that there is a safe home for them to return to, and to demonstrate that we are working toward a better future for those who have been impacted so severely by the Syrian conflict. And with that, I'm pleased to yield to the ranking member of our subcommittee, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Madam Chairman, I was anticipating having a conflict with today's hearing. Mr. Cicilline had agreed to step in, and I'm proud to yield my time to Mr. Cicilline, who's been a leader on the issue of refugees. He organized the first member letter requesting that the refugee cap be lifted in the wake of the migration crisis in Europe, and I'm proud to yield to him.
Thank you, Madam Chairman and Ranking Member Deutsch, for calling this hearing today and for your leadership on these issues. And thank you, Ranking Member Deutsch, for yielding to me. As we've discussed at the first part of this hearing earlier this month, the crisis inside Syria and in the region is escalating and has led to the largest movement of refugees through Europe and the Middle East since World War II. As of September, an estimated 12.2 million people inside Syria, more than half the population, are in need of humanitarian assistance. Of these, more than 7.6 million are displaced inside the country. In addition, more than 4.1 million Syrians have registered as refugees abroad, with most fleeing to countries in the immediate surrounding region, including Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt, and other parts of North Africa. But as we've seen in recent months, as those neighboring countries reach maximum capacity, more refugees are risking dangerous journeys across land and sea into Europe. The United Nations has declared the situation in Syria a level 3 emergency in order to help facilitate mobilization of resources for the humanitarian response. But the distribution of relief supplies within the country remains dependent on guarantees from all parties to the conflict of safe and unhindered access of humanitarian staff. The International Committee of the Red Cross estimates that 5 million people within Syria are located in places that they categorize as difficult to reach by relief workers. I'm extremely concerned about how the new Russian bombing campaign is contributing to violence in Syria, with reports that tens of thousands of people have been displaced in the past few weeks. Syrian human rights organizations have documented cases of Russian strikes on hospitals and medical facilities, and a Human Rights Watch report said that Russian strikes killed 59 civilians on October 15th. With this renewed fighting, pressure on Syria's neighboring countries, and by extension Europe, will only increase. As the weather turns colder, the situation for refugees on the move will only get more perilous. Many host communities are overwhelmed. Overcrowded schools, inadequate hospital services, impacts on resources such as water, all contribute to the burden of neighboring countries. The United States is the largest donor of humanitarian assistance to Syria and the region. From fiscal year 2012 through September 21st, 2015, the United States has allocated more than $4.5 billion to meet Syrian humanitarian needs. This funding includes over $1.5 billion to NGOs, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent, and other international organizations, as well as nearly $3 billion to UN agencies responding to the needs of conflict-affected populations in Syria and the region. Yet, according to UNHCR, chronic funding shortages are greatly limiting aid programs for refugees and host communities in the region. Since 2011, the UN appeals have remained significantly underfunded and recently resulted in cuts to food aid and cash assistance. Lack of assistance is reportedly leading to an increase in negative coping strategies such as begging, child labor, survival, sex, and increased debt. The world can and must do better. It's imperative that when we talk to our allies, particularly in the Gulf countries, that we emphasize the necessity of meeting the humanitarian needs of these refugees. Moreover, while the United States has been the leader in terms of financial response to this crisis, we have fallen short in absorbing refugees. Jordan has absorbed 500,000, Lebanon 1 million, and Turkey 2 million. But since the 2011, the United States has taken in roughly 1,500 Syrian refugees, most of those in the past year. This is simply not acceptable. Last month, as Ranking Member Deutsch mentioned, I led a letter signed by 70 of my colleagues asking the administration to raise that number to 100,000 Syrian refugees by the end of 2017. There is precedent for this. The United States welcomed approximately 200,000 refugees during the Balkan Wars, 700,000 refugees from Cuba, and more than 700,000 refugees from Vietnam. While I was pleased that the administration raised the refugee quota for 2016 to accommodate 10,000 refugees from Syria, I fear that isn't nearly enough to make an impact. Of course, the ultimate accountability for the violence and chaos on Syria and Iraq falls upon the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, whose unspeakable cruelty towards its own people, including the use of chemical weapons, is at the heart of this civil war, as well as upon ISIS. The only way to fully ease the suffering of the Syrian and Iraqi people is to defeat ISIS and bring an end to the civil war in Syria. There is certainly no easy fix for this problem, but I hope that our witnesses today can tell us what steps the administration is taking to bring about a solution to this terrible tragedy and what more we can do. I thank the witnesses again for being here, and thank you for the testimony you're about to provide, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Cicilline. Would you like to add anything, Mr. Deutsch, or you'll wait until? Thank you. Mr. Trott is recognized.
I'd like to start by thanking Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen and Ranking Member Deutsch for holding this important hearing. As the situation in Syria becomes progressively worse, the need to deliver aid to affected people in a timely and efficient manner becomes even more important. We've learned throughout history that, unfortunately, religious minorities are disproportionately affected during dire humanitarian crises. I'm proud to represent a vibrant district with various religious minorities from the Middle East, and one of the most common complaints I hear from them is that aid is not getting to them quickly enough. In April, I wrote a bipartisan letter to USAID with my colleagues in the Michigan delegation asking USAID to consider removing bureaucratic red tape to help these battered communities. 6 months later, my letter remains unanswered. While I understand that USAID is under pressure to ensure that every vulnerable citizen is taken care of, if our aid is not getting to these communities at the right time, our efforts are futile and the crisis only becomes worse. To better coordinate the various humanitarian relief efforts ongoing in the region, I introduced legislation that would require the interested parties to better coordinate with one another to ensure timely relief to these endangered citizens. After spending 30 years in business, I know that the key to success of any project is cooperation and communication, not more red tape, obstacles, and excuses. I yield back my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Trott. Mr. Boyle is recognized.
Thank you, and I would just briefly say that we faced a real turning point in late August ever since the shocking and horrific sight of a small boy's body being washed ashore on a beach in Turkey. That really, I think, awoken the consciousness and the consciences of many people. I was in Europe at that time as part of an international conference, and it clearly changed the dynamic in many Western European countries that had not been stepping up to the plate to do their part. I would say that besides the humanitarian assistance, and I pre-read some of the testimony, and I know that we've had a three-prong approach, clearly our humanitarian assistance has led the world. We're number one in that regard, and we should be quite proud of it. I think the question that I'm searching for an answer, that I really want answered and cannot at this point, is are we going to continue to do a series of one-offs, or will there actually be a worldwide collaborative effort to solve this problem? So in the hearing today and many of the questions that are asked and answered, I hope we could spend a moment and take a look at the United States, not in isolation, but ourselves as part of a larger global solution. Thank you.
Very good, sir. Do any other members wish to be recognized? If not, I'd like to introduce our witnesses, who are three very good friends of our subcommittee. First, we're pleased to welcome back the Honorable Ann C. Richard, who serves as Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration for the Department of State. She has served as the Vice President of Government Relations and Advocacy of the International Rescue Committee and was a non-resident fellow for the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. Welcome back, ma'am. And second, we're pleased to say hello to the Honorable Leon Rodriguez, who is the Director of the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service. Previously, Mr. Rodriguez served as the Director of the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Health and Human Services, and before that served in the United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of Pennsylvania and was a trial attorney in the Civil Division of the Department of Justice. Welcome, Mr. Rodriguez. And now we also welcome back a good friend, Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator Thomas Stahl of the Bureau of Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance at USAID. He has served in USAID since the late 80s and has served as the Director of the Iraq Reconstruction Office. Mr. Stahl also served as the Mission Director in Lebanon, Ethiopia, and Iraq. And you don't have to be a good friend of the subcommittee to be a witness, but we just get good witnesses and we welcome you back. So thank you. Ms. Richard, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Closer to your mouth.
Oh, I can bring this to me. Thank you, Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Deutsch, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs to discuss the Syrian humanitarian crisis. I returned recently from a series of meetings overseas, including my 5th visit to Turkey and my 8th visit to Jordan during my tenure as Assistant Secretary. I greatly appreciate the interest of this committee on this very challenging situation. I would like to briefly outline the steps taken by the Population, Refugees, and Migration Bureau and others at the State Department, USAID, and in the Obama administration to provide humanitarian assistance to innocent civilians and to assist the governments of other countries to deal with the crisis in Syria. As you know, in early September, and as Congressman Boyle just mentioned, the tragic photo of a little boy's body on a beach in Turkey awakened people to the plight of Syrian refugees in ways that years of grim statistics, bleak images, and climbing casualty figures could not. What started as unrest in Syria in 2011 has developed into a multi-front war and spilled over to become a regional crisis. Recently, the crisis reached Europe as hundreds of thousands of young men, women, and sometimes entire families seek to reach that continent by boat, bus, train, and foot. They are joined by refugees and migrants from other countries, chiefly Afghanistan, Eritrea, and Iraq. While the outflow of refugees to Europe has garnered a lot of attention, it is important for us to remember and acknowledge that the vast majority of Syrian families remain in the Middle East. And you just heard the figures in the opening statements of the chair and ranking member that there are more than 4 million refugees in the surrounding countries and roughly 7 million Syrians are displaced within their own country. For more than 4 years, the Obama administration has helped these countries neighboring Syria and the innocent people caught up in the Syria crisis, even as we continue to play a leading role in providing humanitarian aid to people affected by conflicts in many other places. We have a three-pronged approach to the humanitarian aspects of the crisis in Syria and the region: strong levels of humanitarian assistance, active diplomacy, and expanded refugee resettlement. First, the U.S. government is the leading donor of humanitarian assistance to people in need inside Syria, in the surrounding countries, and to others caught up in crises around the world. Through contributions to international organizations such as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the International Organization for Migration, the World Food Program, UNICEF, and leading non-governmental organizations, U.S. funds are being used to save millions of lives. U.S. humanitarian assistance in response to the Syrian conflict, as you've said, totals more than $4.5 billion since the start of the crisis, and is made possible thanks to strong bipartisan support from Congress. Without U.S. support, more people would be making the dangerous voyage further north. Even with our sizable contributions, however, UN appeals for humanitarian aid to address the crisis in Syria remain underfunded, with only 45% of the needs covered as of October 2015. These shortfalls have had real consequences. Cuts to food and other assistance was one of the triggers of the current migration of people to Europe. Syrian refugees in Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon are losing hope of ever returning to their homes. They are unable to work regularly to sustain their families, rents are high, and their children are missing out on school. Roughly 85% of refugees now live outside of camps, and that's something that's not well understood or known. We need to help refugees become self-sufficient while we also support the communities that host them. We are looking at ways to better link our relief and development assistance, and importantly, we are working to get more refugee children in school throughout the region. The second prong of our response is diplomacy on humanitarian issues. For several years, we have engaged government officials in the region to encourage them to keep borders open and allow refugees to enter their countries, authorize the work of leading humanitarian organizations, and allow refugees to pursue normal lives, or as normal a life as possible. Diplomacy on humanitarian issues means working constructively with other nations to find solutions. The issue of the refugee and migration crisis was taken up again and again in recent international fora, and in my testimony, I talk about the places that I've traveled recently and the meetings I've had pursuing our so-called humanitarian diplomacy. Diplomacy also includes pushing, when needed, those who can and should be doing more. We are engaged on encouraging countries that provide assistance outside the UN system to contribute to the UN appeals for Syria. Contributions to UN appeals can help prevent duplication and ensure that assistance is provided to those who need it the most. And we are also encouraging countries to permit refugees to pursue jobs and livelihoods. The third prong of our response is resettling refugees in the United States. As you know, for the past 3 years, we've brought 70,000 refugees from all around the world to the United States. And for this year, the President has determined we should bring 85,000, including at least 10,000 Syrians. We recognize that admitting more Syrian refugees to the United States is only part of the solution, but it is in keeping with our American tradition. It shows the world that we seek to provide refuge for those most in need. It sets an example for others to follow, and it adds the diversity and strength of American society. I have been up on the Hill a couple times recently, and I've been gotten a lot of questions about the process that we use to bring refugees here. They're referred by the UNHCR. We work very carefully to have them tell their stories. No one comes who hasn't been approved by the Department of Homeland Security. And Ileana Rodriguez and I are here to answer any questions you have about the resettlement process, but it generally lasts 18 to 24 months, and we take very seriously the need to secure our borders as part of that program. In conclusion, the vast majority of refugees of the 3 million who have been admitted to the United States, including from some of the most troubled regions in the world, have proven to be hardworking and productive residents. They pay taxes, send their children to school, and after 5 years, may take the test to become citizens. So I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about this three-pronged approach and to provide details about our program.
Thank you very much, Secretary Richard. Mr. Rodriguez.
Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member Deutsch, distinguished members of the committee, thank you all for convening this very important hearing. When I first became Director of USCIS, in fact, during the confirmation process, I knew that the work of operating the refugee admission process, particularly with respect to refugees from various parts of the Middle East, but chief among them Syria, was going to be one of my priorities and one of the most important parts of the work that we do at USCIS. The statistics recited by Congressman Cicilline tell a very grim story of what's going on in Syria today. More than half of the population of Syria is displaced. 4 million people are now essentially in exile somewhere in the Middle East, be it Jordan, be it Turkey, be it Lebanon, be it Egypt. But the individual stories that we hear are probably the most compelling of all. Recently, one of my refugee officers shared with me a story of an individual who was screened, and during the screening process, we learned that he was with his elderly mother during a time when his town was being bombed by the Syrian Air Force. His mother, because of the stress of the bombing, had a heart attack. She ultimately died in his arms, but not after hours, actually, of this young man attempting to resuscitate his mother through CPR and having no access to medical care because of the horrendous conditions in that town. And this is one of legions of stories that we've heard at USCIS from the individuals that we've screened. I took the opportunity this past June to travel to Turkey, where in Istanbul we have a resettlement support center where my officers work with a State Department contractor to screen refugees. And I observed both the screenings, and I observed them incidentally with the particular that I bring as a former criminal prosecutor who has myself conducted thousands of interviews, many of them confrontational interviews, many of them interviews with individuals who I knew were lying to me. So I observed those screenings as they took place. But I also had the opportunity to sit down with the families that were in that resettlement support center. And what was amazing to me is how recognizable those individuals were to me, how familiar they were to me. They were individuals from all walks of life, but they were individuals who really want the same thing that any of us here want, is to get out of harm's way and to find a better life for their family. I had the opportunity to spend a few minutes with the children at the resettlement center, to witness their excitement about their potential new life in America, to hear what they had already learned about our country and their excitement about coming here. So amidst that challenge, the men and women who work in a refugee admissions program do their job. And that essentially involves their doing two things. One, making sure that the individuals who ask for refuge in the United States satisfy the legal requirements in order to obtain that refuge. But two, and importantly, as the chairwoman noted, ensuring that none of those individuals who are seeking refuge in the United States are people who mean us harm. Now, how do we do that? Part of that is done through a suite of biographic and biometric checks, and I'm hoping during the course of the hearing to be able to explain in some detail as to how those work. But the key is we actually have screened out individuals who we identified through that process as being potential threats. So the process has actually worked. But two, as importantly, the refugee officers in our agency are among the most highly trained professionals in the federal government, and they are specifically trained in country conditions to conduct interviews to screen out individuals who may do us harm. That process has also resulted in a number of people being placed, quote, on hold, not permitted to travel to the United States until security concerns can be resolved. I'd like to conclude by dedicating my testimony here today to my maternal grandfather, John Polakar, who I actually never had the opportunity to meet. My grandfather was one of the leaders of the Jewish community in Cuba in the late 1930s and 1940s. And among his activities as a leader of that community was to attempt to assist refugees from Nazi Europe, some of whom had sought refuge here in the United States and were denied that refuge. Many of us have heard the story of the St. Louis, and who then traveled to Cuba, some of whom were able to find refuge there, but some of whom were not. I intend, as director of USCIS, to honor his legacy, first and foremost, by making sure that we don't admit people who do us harm to the United States, but secondly, by making sure that we honor our tradition of offering refuge to those who so desperately need it. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I look forward to answering the committee's questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rodriguez. Excellent testimony. Mr. Stahl.
Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Deutsch, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for your support and the attention today to this Syrian crisis, which grows, as we've heard, more complex every day. For almost 5 years, the Assad regime has waged an unrelenting campaign of bloodshed that has decimated communities and allowed extremists to thrive. And while the world's attention is centered appropriately on the perilous journey of Syrians forced to flee their homeland, the refugees, as we've heard, are part of a much larger community that suffers under the weight of this crisis. Over 17 million Syrians, 70% of the country's pre-war population, are affected by this conflict, with the majority facing daily attacks inside Syria. Indeed, half of all Syrians are either dead or displaced from their homes. While more than 4 million of them gone to neighboring countries, another 6.5 to 7 million are displaced inside Syria. And behind these massive numbers, the children, just like our own, and parents, like any parent, would do anything and risk everything to keep their families safe. families inside Syria face the painful ultimatum: if you stay, your child could be killed on the way to get bread. If you leave, you risk their safety on a dangerous journey across borders. And we're doing everything possible in USAID to alleviate the suffering for families inside Syria, as well as those fleeing to the neighboring countries. The U.S. government has been, as we've heard, the single largest donor to the Syria crisis. And our partners fearlessly cross conflict lines amidst daily barrel bombs and shifting conflict lines to reach people in the regime, in opposition, and even in ISIL-held areas. Today, they face an added layer of threat: Russian aggression on Syrian soil. Several partners report that Russian airstrikes are driving new displacement and complicating access. One heroic partner told us he feels like every time he goes to the hospital that he manages, it's only a matter of time until it will explode. His hospital has been bombed, by the way, over 18 times by the Syrian regime and recently by the Russians. Despite ongoing access and security challenges, we are reaching approximately 5 million people inside Syria and another 1.5 million in the region every month with our humanitarian assistance. And this aid is saving lives and reducing suffering every day. USAID supports inside Syria 140 health facilities. And in FY15 alone, we reached over 2.4 million people with health assistance. And we've provided access to clean water for 1.3 million people. We are the largest donor of food assistance, providing $1.5 billion to date. We provide flour even to bakeries inside Syria and support food vouchers for Syrian refugees that have injected over $1.2 billion into the economies of the Syrian neighbors. And separate from our humanitarian efforts, we help moderate civilian organizations in Syria to provide essential services, providing a lifeline to communities under siege. And then also our development assistance helps Syria's neighbors, who are strained more than ever, to build more resilient public services to cope with the influx of the refugees. With 2 million Syrian children out of school, we are working to ensure that this entire generation is not lost to this crisis. In Jordan and Lebanon, we are expanding public schools, supporting remedial programs, training teachers so that Syrian refugees can thrive alongside their host community peers. We've upgraded water systems and hospitals to help the communities in Jordan and Lebanon and cope with the increased demand. In Lebanon, we're working with young people to decrease tension between host communities and refugees and help them find constructive solutions to common ends. And these efforts, by the way, are possible thanks to the generous support from Congress. Nevertheless, we struggle to meet the escalating needs with stretched dollars. We're working closely with other donors to mobilize resources because we cannot meet the needs alone. Certainly, no amount of humanitarian assistance will stop the suffering or stem the tide of refugees, which is why a negotiated political solution is urgently needed. In the meantime, we are committed to saving lives, alleviating suffering, and helping Syria's neighbors to cope with the largest humanitarian crisis we've ever faced. Thank you for your support, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much to our government agencies for the great work that you are doing under difficult circumstances. I'd like to yield my time to Mr. Shabbat of Ohio.
I thank the Chair Lady for yielding. I'll begin with you, Mr. Rodriguez. During a recent hearing before the House Committee on Homeland Security, FBI Director James Comey stated that government background checks on refugees is limited to only that information which has been previously collected and stored in its database. Given that ISIS has threatened to exploit the current Syrian humanitarian crisis, what's being done to increase scrutiny and the thoroughness of security checks on those seeking refugee status in the United States?
Thank you, Congressman, for that very critical question. We, working together with the State Department, conduct a suite of biographic and biometric checks of individuals who are applying for admission. The biographic checks, in fact, occur before my officers interview the individuals seeking admission. Among the sources of the biographic checks are something called the Interagency Check, which is hosted by the National Counterterrorism Center. That database is populated from information from all kinds of law enforcement and intelligence sources, and there is a constant and ongoing effort to feed that database. It is true, as it has often been true in other places, that we do not currently have any meaningful United States presence inside Syria. Nevertheless, we do have, as we always have had, ability to gather intelligence information, gather law enforcement information, using a number of techniques and doing so in a number of places. And as a result of that process, our officers in 30 cases were able to identify individuals who, in fact, based on their showing up in the databases that I just described, denied those individuals admission. Once we interview individuals, we also take fingerprints. We run those fingerprints against Department of Defense databases, United States law enforcement databases, including both the FBI and also our own Customs and Border Patrol. In those events where some individuals have encountered really United States, either military or law enforcement authorities at some point along the way. But very critically, Congressman, is the interview process. I started my career as a street prosecutor in New York City. And we had all the technology in the world. We could run fingerprints. We could conduct chemical analysis. But at the end of the day, criminal cases were made by New York City police detectives. The work that we do, Congressman, I would suggest is similar. At the end of the day, the judgments that we make are the judgments of the men and women, the highly trained and highly prepared men and women that work in our refugee admission process. They are trained and briefed at a great level of depth in country conditions within Syria. In fact, the interviews that we conduct further populate our understanding about those country conditions, and they use that knowledge, that information, to then test the information that's being given to them by the individuals applying for admission. As a result of that training, hundreds of individuals have either been placed on hold or denied admission altogether because that process of interviewing has identified problems with the account being given by those individuals. So we're going to continue to polish that process. We're going to be continuing to work to further access different sources of intelligence so that we can test individual stories against that information.
Thank you. I'd like to get one more question. I
Sure.
just have a minute left, so either Ms. Richard or Mr. Stahl, whichever one of you wants to handle it. Why has the administration opted to channel aid for the humanitarian crisis through the United Nations rather than through direct aid or NGOs? Would it not be more efficient and cost-effective to work directly with partners on the ground? So either one of you that would like to take that as...
I can start.
Richard?
We
Yes.
do both. We channel aid through the best UN operational agencies, humanitarian agencies, and we also work with the top non-governmental organizations. And we try to use all channels to get aid inside Syria, which Tom is the expert on. And our sense is that because the UN plays a coordinating role and reviews the requests from a whole span of agencies and puts together these appeals, it actually reduces duplication and makes sure that professionals who know what they're doing are responding with the aid. Now, of course, at the same time, most aid workers are from the countries in which they're working. So inside Syria, it's mostly Syrians. In Jordan, it's Jordanians, et cetera. But at the top, there are people who are quite seasoned who are involved in this. Tom, do you want to add anything?
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's an excellent question, and what we try to do is make sure we are using the most effective means and the organizations that can do the job the best in a given area. And sometimes it can vary between different parts of the country. Frankly, in the regime-held areas within Syria, the UN agencies are able to operate most effectively and most broadly into, the far reaches of the areas. In the non-regime areas, we do work also somewhat with the UN, but there we work more with international NGOs. Now, they in turn work through local organizations, and that's a critical aspect that you mentioned. It's difficult for us to work directly with local organizations just through the financial systems and oversight, but through our international NGO partners, they are able to work with local organizations. Indeed, that's how they get there, including with like local councils and civil society organizations that really know the situation on the ground, have the best access. We actually have better reporting and oversight of our programs and our assistance than in many other countries. So even the GAO and RIG shows that our aid is getting to the right people. Okay. And then the nice thing about working with local councils is that you're building some local capacity so that hopefully when the regime, well, excuse me, when the crisis is over, you've got some local capacity to build up again.
Thank you very much. My time's expired. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Deutsch is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm going to yield to Mr. Cicilline.
Mr. Cicilline.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Undersecretary Richard, if I could begin with you, can you explain, I recognize this is a complicated process, but could you explain to us from sort of beginning to end how a refugee from Syria might navigate the process to be admitted to the United States, how long that typically takes, where's the first contact, how many agencies are involved and have jurisdiction over this determination, and kind of just explain sort of the process, because I think people have sort of a mistaken impression that they just show up and they're admitted, and sort of a better understanding of kind of what that process is.
Thank you, Congressman. The process lasts 18 to 24 months. The refugees are identified as people who are particularly vulnerable in the places where they've fled. So I guess the process starts when they decide to leave their country, which is a very challenging thing. They cross the borders, they try to live as well as they can for a time, but they may come to the attention of UNHCR or other aid workers who will then look at their case and see if there are certain characteristics about them that would make them match what we're looking for. What we're looking for is that they have to fit the definition of a refugee, which is someone fleeing persecution for one of, they have a well-founded fear of persecution for one of 5 reasons, which is race, religion, nationality, political belief, or membership in a social group. And we also, though, seek to bring those who are the most vulnerable people. So that might be someone who has been tortured or has a specific medical condition that makes it very hard to survive where they are, or just people for whom there is never going to be a chance to go home again. The first contact then is really with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. They refer them to us. They do not choose who gets admission to the United States, but they refer the cases they think are likely to fit what we're looking for. And then the process continues where we have a relationship with several resettlement support centers, RSCs, in different places around the world, where they will work with the refugee, the individual or the family, and put the case together of how they became a refugee and make the case that they do actually qualify for refugee status. As part of that, they have a series of background checks, and then this picks up where Leon Rodriguez was describing the types of checks, the fingerprints, the medical background, the biographic history, until they get interviewed by that DHS officer who has traveled out to the field, usually in a circuit ride, and is interviewing people during the course of a day. For Syrians, it's 3 per day, and really double checking several things. And they're trying to screen out people who are lying to us, people with a criminal past, or people who are, of course, would-be terrorists. So once that all has happened, and the final checks work out, they are scheduled then to be brought to the United States. They are brought to the U.S. escorted by the International Organization for Migration. So that's 2 UN agencies involved, UNHCR and the International Organization for Migration.
If I can just interrupt you before, so after they got to the United States, I understand the process, but that process you just described, is that any different than the process that was in place when the United States accepted 200,000 refugees from the Balkans, or 700,000 refugees from Cuba, or 700,000 refugees from Vietnam? Is it improved? Is it the same?
After 9/11, the security aspects of that program were tightened quite a bit. And then again, in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of effort to scrub the program to make it as efficient as possible without cutting corners on security. And right now, we're under direction from the White House to keep doing that and keep seeing if we can speed up the length of the process without doing anything to undermine security.
And this has been described by some as the most intensive vetting process in the federal government, an interagency.
Well, for any traveler to the United States.
For any traveler to the
I mean,
United
no traveler to the United States gets this kind of intense vetting, yeah.
And are there any limitations, assuming you had additional resources, Director Rodriguez or Undersecretary Richard, any limitations on your ability to do this for more refugees if you were provided the additional resources to do it, to go through this process? Are there any other obstacles?
I mean, I think this is it's always a resource question. And so right now, we have about 100 refugee officers. We have an asylum corps of 400 plus that we can draw from to supplement. They're trained very similarly or just about identically to the refugee officers. But these situations always require us to adapt, to build to whatever the task is that's in front of us. And we've actually, my agency's become very good, and I know PRM has become very good at adapting when these challenges are presented to us. But does it put further stress on our resources? No question.
You know, just in talking about it, we knew that we can't change the numbers like a dial on a I don't know, do people make things with dials anymore? Dial on an old-fashioned stereo. Because, you know, even if he were to get more funding to get more interviewers, they have to be recruited and they have to be trained before they're sent out. And then the conditions overseas kick in, which is some places where we had wanted to carry out interviews in the past are their security concerns. And so we, you know, have to make sure we're not sending the officers somewhere where they themselves would get into trouble. But then also sometimes there's acts of God. We had to slow down bringing people from Nepal last year after the earthquake happened this past year. So they have to be able to travel out to the places where the refugees are ready to be interviewed. And in the Middle East, there have been some security issues, same with the Dadaab camp in Kenya. And also there are parts of Africa that are just hard to get to. You can't just fly in and fly out without careful planning.
Thank you. I see my time is up. Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chairman.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Boyle. Oh. Ms. Frankel.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the witnesses. And I agree with my colleagues here who have said that they consider this one of the great humanitarian, probably the greatest humanitarian crisis of our time right now. So I just want to, just get a couple things clarified. I got a little confused on the refugees. It sounds to me, you say there are millions displaced within Syria and 4 million displaced out of Syria. How would you quantify the number of refugees that would like to come to the United States? What figure would that be?
Well, they don't get to come if they'd like to come to the United States. I think it's probably a very large number, but not 100%. Because most refugees usually want to go home.
No, I'm not saying that. I just want to know what you think is the
What the UNHCR does is they believe that of 15 million refugees that they're concerned about, that about 1 million are people who are suitable for resettlement in other countries.
So how does this come about? So does someone leave Syria in order to be considered by us? They have to, and is there any type of prioritization? I mean, if you're a family member, or is it first in line, or first to sign up, or?
It's who is, first you have to qualify to be a refugee, And
And
then
what is the
secondly,
what do you?
based on the legal definition, which were those 5 factors, well-founded fear of persecution. And then we seek to resettle the people who are the most vulnerable, who
Which would be who?
so it's widows with children or orphan children or people who have medical conditions that make it very difficult for them to get the treatment they need in a refugee camp, people who are burn victims and can, benefit from maybe, the type of medical services we can provide here. Torture victims, people who, feel that they'll never be able to go home again. They've seen terrible things happen.
So if you're able to process someone, do most of these folks have somebody in the United States that they're coming to settle with, or they're just coming here on their own? And
If they have a family, if they have a relative in the United States, we seek to reunite the families.
And if they don't,
And if
there
they-
are services that you can
What
connect them
happens
with?
is when they arrive in the U.S., they're met at the airport by a representative, one of 9 national networks we have. 6 are faith-based, 3 are not. But they work in 170 cities across the United States. And they use a lot of volunteers. They'll take the refugee from the airport to their new home. It's probably an apartment that's been set up for them, and it may have been furnished with donated furniture. And then they will make sure that there's a meal in the refrigerator and show them how to turn it off and on the lights. And depending on where they're from, sometimes some of the modern conveniences are new. And then the next day they take them to help get their new life started. And that could be using the bus, going to the grocery store, getting a Social Security number, getting the kids enrolled in school.
And as to the USID, your workers are not in Syria. I think that's what you said. How many aid workers are dedicated now to Syrian relief, and where are they?
Yeah, that's correct. Our aid workers are not inside Syria. We have a team in Jordan and another team in southern Turkey. It's a disaster assistance response team, and then they work with our implementing partners, NGOs, UN, and who in turn have local partners who work inside. So there are no Americans or international staff inside Syria.
And are the workers inside, is it basically food and medicine?
It's actually quite a bit more. I mean, food and medicine are a big part of it, but it's also helping to repair water systems, even schools. We've trained teachers and helped rebuild things. Sometimes it's an underground school, that's safe. Building capacity of local councils. We work with, we've trained hundreds and hundreds of first responders who are, like the fire department in a number of cities inside Syria. They've been a huge thing, and they're independent. They're volunteers, but we provide them training and even equipment. We've given fire trucks and things like that.
Terrific.
So we do a variety of things inside Syria.
Madam Chair, may I ask another question, or just wait for another round, or?
Oh, please, go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Frankel.
Thanks. I'd like to just, if you all have an opinion, I'd like to hear what your opinion is of what would happen if we were not doing this aid, and what does that mean to our, not just to the humanitarian part of this, which I think we all understand, but I think a lot of people what they don't understand is that a lot of this effort really goes towards our national security. Because what happens, I mean, we're about to lose a generation of children, it looks like, and hopelessness breeds a lot of bad things. But I'd like to hear it from your own words as to why your missions are so important.
Well, Congresswoman, I'm convinced that, as I mentioned in my testimony, we're saving millions of lives with this aid, because some of it from USAID is backing up the World Food Program that is feeding so many people, vaccinations that go to children that if they're not vaccinated, that makes them susceptible to really dangerous diseases. So there's a life-saving piece of this. But then there's the life enriching part of it too. And that's what I think you were getting at with our concerns about losing a generation of Syrian children. Many are out of school, have been out of school for years. To the extent that there are places in school, it's pretty tough for them. You know, if they go to Turkey, they're living surrounded by a different language, Turkish. But even in Lebanon and Jordan, they sometimes go to a second shift of school where they're trying to catch up to where they would have been had they stayed in school throughout. Too many girls are getting married young. Boys are and girls are sent to work early. So they're really missing out on childhoods, missing out on education. And for those who are just left idle, they're really susceptible, I think, to bad influences. We see what happened when the rest of the world did not provide the funding to these UN appeals. I think thanks to Congress, we have done our share of funding the UN appeals for the Syria crisis and for many other crises around the world. But we weren't matched at the same levels by the rest of the world. Part of it was because the number of crises has grown and the needs have grown. But you see what happened was when the World Food Program started to cut back on food assistance and vouchers, that may have played a role in triggering the numbers of people streaming out of the Middle East and walking and taking dangerous journeys to Europe. So it is very destabilizing. It's destabilizing for the neighboring countries. It's destabilizing now for various parts of Europe. And I think that shows you that had we not been there, things would have been much worse.
Congresswoman, this is who we are as Americans, put simply. My parents were refugees from Cuba who were offered refuge, as was the chair. I would not be surprised if there are other stories of either being refugees or children of refugees, certainly in this chamber today. And that has been our tradition as a country as far back as anybody can remember. When we talk about the importance of this work, it is certainly a humanitarian task that we are engaged in, and I think you've certainly painted very clearly sort of the scope of this problem, but it also promotes the stability of that region for us to take responsibility for refugees and for us to lead by example as far as other countries. It has been our history that we have always taken a disproportionate share of refugees that has inspired other resettlement countries to do the same. And I would hope, and I think it is certainly the President's intention, that we continue to honor that tradition.
If I might add as well, my colleagues have stated very eloquently, but I think it's important even to realize, notwithstanding the scale and scope of this crisis, there has not been large famine or major disease outbreaks, things like that, which would have been very likely without our assistance. And so it's been amazingly successful, actually, given the constraints that they actually have to work with, both inside Syria and in the neighboring countries, and that's something to remember. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Frankel. Ms. Meng is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member Deutsch, and to all our witnesses for being here today. As the weather gets colder, as winter approaches, how are our partners, implementing partners on the ground, helping to prepare winter for the refugees and displaced persons?
I could begin the response, especially within Syria. That's been the major focus of our efforts, in addition to basic food and health supplies. We've been focusing over the last month or so on providing things like blankets and coats and additional supplies for the winter wherever we can get it in. And that's why it's important for us to work throughout the country wherever we can, either in regime-held areas or in opposition-held areas, as long as we can be sure that it gets to the right people, which we have been able to do. But yeah, that's a major issue for us inside Syria, and I know for the refugees as well. Thank you.
And how are we supporting our European allies, and what more can we do as they absorb the large influx of refugees? And how can we urge countries that have made pledges of humanitarian aid to fulfill those commitments?
Well, we are responding to the appeals put out by UNHCR and the International Organization for Migration for their activities in Europe. They're really focused on the periphery of Europe, so to speak, so Serbia, Macedonia, Greece. And part of what they're doing is trying to make sure that as people approach borders and cross borders, that they're treated humanely and not as criminals, but as people who deserve a hearing to determine whether they deserve asylum or not, and people who need help along the way. So that's a piece of what we're doing, but it's nowhere near the size and scope of what we're doing closer to Syria in the region. The other thing we're doing is we're participating in international conversations with the European leaders. We did that in New York at the UN General Assembly. I just came from Istanbul from the Global Forum for Migration Development. You know, I've met with everyone from the German foreign minister to the Swedish migration minister to the Lebanese prime minister. We're talking to them, asking them, what do you need? What can we do to help you? One of the proposals is that we try to do a better job internationally, pulling people together to do more, not just in terms of money, which is part of it, but certainly in terms of resettlement, work visas, family unification, humanitarian visas, trying to get permission for refugees to work in the places to which they've fled, trying to get kids in school, trying to get development assistance, also tapped to help governments like Lebanon and Jordan, whose societies are really strained by having done the right thing. So that gives you a little flavor for the kind of international diplomatic exchanges we're having right now.
Thank you so much, Ms. Meng. Mr. Deutsch.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate it. Thanks, Assistant Secretary Richard and Deputy Assistant Administrator Stahl for being with us again today. We appreciate your willingness to keep a dialogue with the subcommittee. I've been clear where I stand on the need for increased humanitarian aid, the support by our allies around the world, the tension, the need for action in Syria, and the need for a real and serious discussion on the practicality of a safe zone. And I hope that we'll have that conversation. But today, I want to take advantage of Director Rodriguez's presence to explore the process. And I appreciate what you've shared already. I will tell you, I've written to the chairman of the Judiciary Committee asking for a hearing on this topic as well. Perhaps we'll have the opportunity to delve into these issues further there also. So I'd just like to walk through a few questions. You talked about USCIS's role in the U.S. refugee admissions program. You talked about the interviews to determine who's eligible for refugee status. You said that applicants for refugee status are interviewed in person. Who's responsible for conducting those interviews?
Sorry. Those interviews are conducted by refugee officers who are part of our refugee admissions program.
And what's, I know you talked about the way cases are solved in New York, but can you talk about the role of these refugee officers in adjudicating the application for refugee status?
So I think the way to describe that role is first to talk about both the training and briefing process that they take into so they all participate in a 5-week training course as officers, followed by a specialized training course as refugee officers. Once we know that they're going to be deployed to a particular environment, let's use the case of screening Syrian refugees, they receive a specific 8-day briefing prior to their deployment. The purpose of that briefing is to steep them in the country conditions that are applicable to the country from which these individuals are coming. And those country conditions consist of all the things that you would think. In what part of the country is the government dominant? In what part of the country is ISIS dominant? What are the specifics of what's going on in a particular province? In much more that would really be difficult to talk about in a public hearing, but I think you get the sense of the kind of content with which they are briefed.
And how many of them are there? How many of them have been trained to deal with Syrian refugees?
In total, in total there are 100. I don't know specifically how many are trained. What I will tell you is that, for example, in Istanbul, at any time, we will have deployed either a team of either 5 or 10, depending on how many cases are actually ready for their interview.
And are there specific security checks that have been instituted specifically for Syrian applicants?
It is the Syrian vetting is the most intense vetting that we conduct. I talked about the interagency checks.
Yeah, which agencies are consulted?
A number of intelligence agencies, a number of law enforcement agencies are populating the database that we use for the information check, including specific databases that identify individuals who may be terrorists.
And while their application is pending, where do they reside?
They may reside in specific, depending on where they are. A lot of that depends on where they are. They could be in refugee camps. A large number of them are. In certain cases,
they're abroad.
They're abroad. Yeah, they're certainly not in their country, and they're certainly not here in the United States.
And the U.S. refugee admission ceiling over the last 3 fiscal years has been 70,000. Would USCIS have the capability to conduct these extensive security evaluations and interviews if the cap were raised to 85,000?
Absolutely, Congressman. We do our job no matter what.
And if it were raised to 100,000?
As I said, Congressman, we will do our job. We understand how critically important it is that we absolutely do our job and leave no stone unturned when it comes to conducting these security checks. We will not cut corners.
And you said that hundreds have been placed on hold or denied altogether. Do you know what those specific numbers are?
I apologize. I don't remember them right now. I usually have them at my fingertips, but I certainly can provide them to the members in response to briefers.
If you would. And finally, I want to thank you for the work that's being done. I want to thank you for your testimony here today to help provide some much-needed context and to push back against some of the statements that have been made wholly without any factual basis about the review that's done, the extent of the review, and I think without a full, or in many cases without any appreciation for the efforts that are undertaken every day to go through this refugee process and to contribute to our nation's safety. You said in your opening testimony that it's important to you to honor our tradition of offering refuge to those who desperately need it. I agree, and I thank you sincerely for the work that you do.
Thank you, Congressman.
Amen. And how touching to dedicate this program, in your mind, to the legacy of your grandfather. Very touching.
Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Connolly of Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and welcome to the panel. Ms. Richard, we got 12.2 million Syrians within Syria who are in need of humanitarian assistance. We got, in a country with 4.5 million people, Lebanon, 1.1 million Syrian refugees. In Jordan, 10% of the country's population are Syrian refugees at equivalent. To what extent are we concerned about the destabilizing effect of long-term refugee presence in small, delicate countries in the Middle East region?
Thank you for your question. We're very concerned about it. It's one reason that we are very often in discussion with these government officials in those countries. We have a very strong aid program in Jordan that is stretching now to do more to help the communities that are have taken in all these refugees. I've been very influenced by the High Commissioner for Refugees, who's visiting Washington just now, Antonio Guterres, who really believed that this required more than just relief to the refugees, but also requires help to the communities whose hospital beds are filled, whose schools have gone to second shifts to accommodate Syrian children, whose water systems are straining, water and sanitation systems. You know, on a municipal level, there's a lot more people there in both Jordan and Lebanon. I mentioned that I recently came back from Jordan. That was my 8th visit in the 3.5 years I've been Assistant Secretary, so we have a very close working relationship with them. In Lebanon, I had met with the Prime Minister when he was in New York in September. He'd met me several times before, so we have a good conversation there. We're particularly interested in doing 2 things. One is making sure that these development resources come into these countries, whether it's from USAID or the World Bank and multilateral mechanisms. And then the other is to make sure that children get into school, because we think that's one of the most worrisome things right now, is that there's a whole generation of Syrian children who are out of school and you know, in danger of being unskilled and at loose ends.
What do we have an estimate of the total population of Syrian refugees that will need to be permanently resettled, that are not going to be going back to Syria?
I don't think we have an estimate of that. It's very much done on a case-by-case basis, and we work with UNHCR to identify the most vulnerable cases. They sought to, starting in September 2013, they started to look at targeting a certain number of Syrians, and it's now up to 130,000 Syrians as a goal. And they had referred 20,000 of that number to us. And in recent months, it's climbed to 22,000. The U.S. will probably end up taking most of the Syrian refugees who are referred for resettlement, but we are also trying to convince other countries to also do their share.
Right. And I want to get to that, but the number we've decided, the President announced, is 10,000. Is that not correct?
That's correct, for this fiscal year.
Right. How do we arrive at that number? Based on what?
Well, we had been planning to bring between 5,000 and 8,000, and the President pushed us to stretch and really gear up to take more. And that's, you know, makes sense as we're adding 15,000 refugees to our overall ceiling. And then the number for the following year we haven't determined yet. And in part, that's because we want to see how well we do this year or in the first half of the year in getting more Syrians to the United States.
And what progress are we making in pressing Gulf partners, both to accept refugees and to help finance the humanitarian services that are so desperately needed in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and elsewhere?
I would say our scorecard on that is very uneven. It's very uneven. We've seen how Kuwait has held 3 major pledging conferences for the Syria crisis, and they themselves provided hundreds of millions of dollars several years running and followed through on their pledges. But not all of the Gulf states do that. Some give very little, some give a little bit and then don't pledge some and then don't follow through. The UAE, in addition to Kuwait, has done several hundred millions of dollars. In general, none of these states resettle refugees. They are permitting Syrians to come and work in their countries. So that's one way that they are sheltering Syrians and their families, but that's normally a temporary situation.
And a drop in the bucket.
We need more. We need more.
Madam Chairman, my time is up, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Rohrabacher of California.
So when we're talking about this great challenge that we face, you're saying that these oil-rich Gulf states are bringing people in as guest workers? How many, do we know what magnitude that is? How many people are we talking about?
I don't have those facts,
Talking about
sorry.
5,000 people, we're talking about 20,000, we're talking about 50?
We'll get you that information. Because what happened was when in the last month in September with the Europe migration, there's been a lot more criticism of the Gulf states, and then
Right.
some of them pushed back and provided more information than we had previously had. So I'll get you that.
How many migrants do we know have gone into Europe in these last 18 months?
It's hundreds of thousands. It's upwards of 600,000.
Upwards
right now.
600,000.
With more
And
expected in.
we don't know if the Gulf states have even brought in 10,000 people.
Well, I probably should know, but I don't know today.
All right, I
Sorry.
appreciate that. Now we're talking about here is bringing in 70,000, is it, or 75,000 here to the United States?
The past 3 years, we've brought 70,000 refugees from all around the world to the United States. Last year, we brought 1,700 Syrians as part of that 70,000.
1,700 out of 70,000.
That's right. And then for this year, we intend to bring 85,000 refugees to the United States and 10,000 Syrians.
And 10,000. Where are the rest of the refugees from, by the way, just the other countries?
The top countries they're coming from are Iraq, Burma, and Somalia.
Okay, Iraq. How many are coming?
But they come from 67 different countries.
How many are coming from Iraq?
I have that and can tell you that. So 12,676 came from Iraq at the fiscal year that just ended September 30th.
12,000. Now, of these people, one thing that we have noticed that the migrants coming into Europe, we have just seemed to notice that they seem to be very strong young men who are virile and Muslims, leaving this Muslim part of the world to go into this other part of the world that's not a Muslim part of the world, and they're getting away from conflict and they're going there. Is there any, let me ask you this, of the people that we are bringing in, are they going to be Muslim men are going to Europe, or is there some way that we are trying to see that we have maybe a better definition of refugee, helpless people who are in need, rather than bringing more Muslim men into the United States and into Western Europe?
Well, of the 1,700 that we've brought, only 2% were young men, young adult single men. Of course we bring men, we bring families that have had terrible things happen to them. I would question, I guess, some of the thinking behind your statement about the young, able-bodied Muslim men walking to Europe. I think the reason that they're able to walk to Europe is because they're able-bodied. And I think the reason they're going is because they've lost hope in the places they're living now of being able to finish their educations or have an education or have a job or earn some money and support their family.
Well, I would tell you, when we see these pictures of thousands and thousands of young Muslim men in the streets in Western Europe, one thing has to be a priority. We want to help refugees or whose lives are in danger. That's our moral stand here. This is what makes us Americans. We care about people who are in danger like that. But when you're talking about the people that I've seen are military-age people who, if they are against radical Islam, they should be there fighting radical Islam. And I hope that let me ask you in terms of religion, of the people who are here, of the people who are coming. We know that the Christian community in Syria and in Iraq and in that part of the world has been targeted for, most of us would consider it to be genocide. They take the Christians out and they just massacre them. Now, there are other Muslims that Sunnis and Shiites kill each other. That's clear. But it's pretty hard to miss the fact that the Christian community in that part of the world has been targeted for extinction. Should we not then try to prioritize so that we take care of those people who are targeted for extinction rather than just people who are caught up in a horrible situation?
All right, three very quick points. One is that the Muslim men going to Europe, some of them are trying to avoid being drafted into Assad's regime, into his army, and so I'm very sympathetic to them for that. Second, Europe is in history primarily Christian, but today there are a lot of Muslims already living throughout Europe, I assure you, Congressman. And then third, we do agree with you that the Christian community is being targeted, particularly by ISIL. As the High Commissioner reminded me today, the ones who are most targeted, the most vulnerable, are the Yazidi, who are not Christian, but are considered therefore not of the book, and are therefore even more miserably treated and murdered and raped. So we agree with you that this qualifies then refugees who have fled because they are Christians or other ethnic or religious minorities as particularly vulnerable. And it does help them put their case together that they should be particularly helped, and
Well,
also
then
for
give
resettlement
priority.
in the United States.
I would hope that we give priority to Christians and other people who have been actually targeted for their faith. And also let me note about whatever we have to say about Assad trying to murder those people who would create a more democratic Syria. He did offer safe haven to Christians for a long time, and that's at least one thing that we need to recognize. If Christian community in the Middle East is indeed being targeted for genocide, we need to understand that, we need to target that, and we need to act with that part of the assumption of how we're going to handle this great humanitarian crisis that we now face in the Middle East. Thank you for doing your part. God bless you. We're going to work with you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rohrabacher. Mr. Rodriguez, I wanted you to have another opportunity to walk us through the vetting process. This hearing is being broadcast through C-SPAN 3, and then they will view it, they will run it a few more times, so maybe some in the television audience have not had a chance, because they just plugged in now, to talk about and to hear you talk about how the vetting process that you have in place, how secure you feel that is, how comfortable you feel that there is the existing security screening process that we have is able to identify potential extremists and threats to the United States. If you could walk us through that process about what your department is doing, sir.
Thank you, Chairwoman, for that opportunity. And Undersecretary Richard actually did a very nice job of walking through the broader process, which of course starts with the first encounter with the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees. Then they go to a resettlement contractor that works with the Department of State. That begins the first part, two of the first critical parts of the vetting process, which is UNHCR itself conducts an interview of the individual in order to determine whether they're stating a refugee claim. That's information that we receive and then later on becomes part of our interview process. The biographic checks, basically based on the pedigree information, if you will, that's given to us by the applicant's refugee status, are tested against three important databases. First is the Consular Lookout database, which is maintained by the State Department. It essentially describes people who've been encountered during the consular process. In some cases, we look to the FBI to give us something called the Security Advisory Opinion, which again looks to a series of sources that are both law enforcement and intelligence sources, but most critically for this particular population is the third of the databases that I mentioned, which is the interagency check. That interagency check queries against a number of law enforcement and intelligence sources and the community that's working in partnership, the National Security Council, the National Counterterrorism Center, the State Department, us. We are in a constant process of thinking about how we further strengthen those sources, not just to vet Syrians, but to vet anybody else, be it Iraqis, be it Afghans, as Somalis, as the case might be. So as I indicated before, that process, just in the Syrian case, has identified 30 individuals who, just as part of that process, were identified as having derogatory history, were denied admission at that point. We then get to the point where our officers conduct the interview. So by the time they're doing that, they have the benefit of the interview that's already been conducted by the High Commissioner. They have the results of these checks. But very critically, they have not only their own deep understanding of the country conditions about which they had been briefed prior to deployment, but they also have their experience in interviewing individuals. And so through that, they also gain a lot of depth of understanding of what makes sense, of what adds up, what's credible. And so through that process, they're making decisions about whether people will in fact move to the next stage, or whether in fact there is a problem with the account they're given. Sometimes that problem could be a contradiction between what they're saying during the screening interview and what they told the High Commission. Sometimes it can be that the information they're giving is completely inconsistent with the country conditions as we know them. And by the way, the information that we gather, we often nominate that information to be part of intelligence databases, because we get information that is then used to deepen our understanding of what's going on, whether it's in Syria or somewhere else. And of course, that then fortifies the work that we're doing in the future. Is the process risk-free? There is no risk-free process. Are we doing the absolute best that we can practically with the resources? Are we giving our folks the best training we can give them? Are we using the best intelligence resources that we can get our hands on? And the answer to that is absolutely yes.
Thank you very much. Ms. Richard and Mr. Stahl, I wanted to give you an opportunity in case you had any concluding statement that you would like to make.
You know, you'll notice that we all said that we're able to do this with the bipartisan support of Congress. And we actually say that to people in other countries too, and explain to them that no matter what they hear about Washington, this program actually has benefited year in and year out from bicameral, bipartisan support. And it's my desire to keep it that way. And I appreciate both of you sticking this out to the end here and your help to help us to keep it that way, because I think there is a risk that as we bring more people and as there's more press attention to the program and attention from during a presidential campaign season, that people could start misinterpreting the goals of this. This is an American program. It's a fine American tradition. I think most Americans should take pride in both our overseas humanitarian endeavors and our domestic ones. So thank you in advance for the help you're giving us with your colleagues to continue the strong support we get. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of you for the great work you're doing. Mr. Stahl?
Yes, and thank you very much for holding this hearing and also for identifying that it's not only the Syrians themselves who are suffering, but the countries in the region, and the importance of maintaining their stability, but also their ability to absorb these additional refugees and people, and that's a critical part of the resources that you provide us, not only the humanitarian side, but even the development dollars are providing assistance to this crisis. And of course, at the end of the day, though, no matter how much we do on the humanitarian side, that's not going to resolve the problem. That's not even going to stop people from going to Europe. It's resolving the political issues and getting the solution there, and that's what we all hope for. Thank you very much.
Amen. Thank you very much, and we look forward to having you back with us in a few months' time so you can update us on the progress you have made. Thank you very much, and with that, our subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you.